Part 1 of The Ruby and the Cauldron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Carolyn. The Ruby and the Cauldron by Anna Katharine Green. Part 1. As there were two good men on duty that night, I did not see why I should remain at my desk, even though there was an unusual stir created in our small town by the grand ball given at the Evergreens. But just as I was preparing to start for home, an imperative ring called me to the telephone and I heard, "Hello, is this the police station?" "It is." "Well then, a detective is wanted at once at the Evergreens. He cannot be too clever or too discreet. A valuable jewel has been lost, which must be found before the guests disperse for home. Large reward if the matter ends successfully and without too great publicity." "May I ask who is speaking to me?" "Mrs. Ashley." It was the mistress of the Evergreens and giver of the ball. "Madam, a man shall be sent at once. Where will you see him?" "In the butler's pantry at the rear. Let him give his name as Jennings." "Very good. Good-bye." "Good-bye." A pretty piece of work. Should I send Hendricks or should I send Hicks? Hendricks was clever and Hicks was discreet, but neither united both qualifications in the measure demanded by the sensible and quietly resolved woman with whom I had just been talking. What alternative remained? But one. I must go myself. It was not late, not for a ball night at least, and as half the town had been invited to the dance, the streets were alive with carriages. I was watching the blink of their lights through the fast falling snow when my attention was drawn to a fact which struck me as peculiar. These carriages were all coming my way instead of rolling in the direction of the Evergreens. Had they been empty this would have needed no explanation, but as far as I could see, most of them were full and that, too, with loudly talking women and gesticulating men. Something of a serious nature must have occurred at the Evergreens. Rapidly I paced on, and soon found myself before the great gates. A crowd of vehicles of all descriptions blocked the entrance. None seemed to be passing up the driveway, all stood clustered at the gates, and as I drew nearer I perceived many an anxious head thrust from their quickly opened doors, and heard many an ejaculation of disappointment as the short interchange of words went on between the drivers of these various turnouts, and a man drawn up in quiet resolution before the unexpectedly barred entrance. Slipping around to this man's side, I listened to what he was saying. It was simple but very explicit. "Mrs. Ashley asks everybody's pardon, but the ball cannot go on tonight. Something has happened which makes the reception of further guests impossible. Tomorrow evening she will be happy to see you all. The dance is simply postponed." This he had probably repeated 40 times, and each time it had probably been received with the same mixture of doubt and curiosity which now held the lengthy procession in check. Not wishing to attract attention, yet anxious to lose no time, I pressed up still nearer and, bending toward him from the shadow cast by a convenient post, uttered the one word: "Jennings." Instantly he unlocked a small gate at his right. I passed in and, with professional sang-froid, proceeded to take my way to the house through the double row of evergreens bordering the semicircular approach. As these trees stood very close together and were besides heavily laden with fresh fallen snow, I failed to catch a glimpse of the building itself until I stood in front of it. Then I saw that it was brilliantly lighted, and gave evidence here and there of some festivity, but the guests were too few for the effect to be very exhilarating, and passing around to the rear, I sought the special entrance to which I had been directed. A heavy-browed porch, before which stood a carter's wagon, led me to a door which had every appearance of being the one I sought. Pushing it open, I entered without ceremony, and speedily found myself in the midst of 20 or more colored waiters and chattering housemaids. To one of the former I addressed the question: "Where is the butler's pantry? I am told that I shall find the lady of the house there." "Your name?" was the curt demand. "Jennings." "Follow me." I was taken through narrow passages and across one or two store rooms to a small but well lighted closet, where I was left with the assurance that Mrs. Ashley would presently join me. I had never seen this lady, but I had often heard her spoken of as a woman of superior character and admirable discretion. She did not keep me waiting. In 2 minutes the door opened and this fine, well-poised woman was telling her story in the straightforward manner I so much admire and so seldom meet with. The article lost was a large ruby of singular beauty and a great value, the property of Mrs. Burton, the senator's wife, in whose honor this ball was given. It had not been lost in the house, nor had it been originally missed that evening. Mrs. Burton and herself had attended the great football game in the afternoon, and it was on the college campus that Mrs. Burton had first dropped her invaluable jewel. But a reward of $500 having been at once offered to whoever should find and restore it, a great search had followed, which ended in its being picked up by one of the students and brought back as far as the great step leading to the front door, when it had again disappeared, and in a way to rouse conjecture of the strangest and most puzzling character. The young man who had brought it thus far bore the name of John Deane, and was a member of the senior class. He had been the first to detect its sparkle in the grass, and those who were near enough to see his face at that happy moment saw that it expressed the utmost satisfaction at his good luck. "You see," said Mrs. Ashley, "he has a sweetheart, and $500 looks like a fortune to a young man just starting life. But he was weak enough to take this girl into his confidence, and on their way here, for both were invited to the ball, he went so far as to pull it out of his pocket and show it to her. They were admiring it together, and vaunting its beauties to the young lady friend who had accompanied them, when their carriage turned into the driveway and they saw the lights of the house flashing before them. Hastily restoring the jewel to the little bag he had made for it out of the finger end of an old glove, a bag in which he assured me he had been careful to keep it safely tied ever since picking it up on the college green, he thrust it back into his pocket and prepared to help the ladies out. But then a disturbance arose in front. A horse which had been driven up was rearing in a way that threatened to overturn the light buggy to which he was attached. As the occupants of this buggy were ladies, and seemed to have no control over the plunging beast, young Deane naturally sprang to the rescue. Bidding his own ladies alight and make for the porch, he hurriedly ran forward, and pausing in front of the maddened animal, waited for an opportunity to seize him by the rein. He says that as he stood there facing the beast with fixed eye and raised hand, he distinctly felt something strike or touch his breast. But the sensation conveyed no meaning to him in this excitement, and he did not think of it again till, the horse well in hand and the two alarmed occupants of the buggy rescued, he turned to see where his own ladies were, and beheld them looking down at him from the midst of a circle of young people drawn from the house by the screaming of the women. Instantly a thought of the treasure he carried recurred to his mind, and dropping the rein of the now quieted horse, he put his hand to his pocket. The jewel was gone! He declares that for a moment he felt as if he had been struck on the head by one of the hoofs of the frantic horse he had just handled, but immediately the importance of his loss and the necessity he felt for instant action restored him to himself, and, shouting aloud, "I have dropped Mrs. Burton's ruby," begged everyone to stand still while he made a search for it. This all occurred, as you must know, more than 1 hour and a half ago, consequently before many of my guests had arrived. My son, who was one of the few spectators gathered on the porch, tells me that there was only one other carriage behind the one in which Mr. Deane had brought his ladies. Both of these had stopped short on the stepping-stone, and as the horse and buggy which had made all this trouble had by this time been driven to the stable, nothing stood in the way of his search but the rapidly accumulating snow, which, if you remember, was falling very thick and fast at the time. My son, who had rushed in for his overcoat, came running down with offers to help him. So did some others, but with an imploring gesture he begged to be allowed to conduct the search alone, the ground being in such a state that the delicately mounted Jewel ran a great risk of being trodden into the snow and thus injured or lost. They humoured him for a moment, then, seeing that his efforts bade fair to be fruitless, my son insisted upon joining him, and the two looked the ground over, inch by inch, from the place where Mr. Deane had set foot to the ground in alighting from his carriage to the exact spot where he had stood when he had finally seized hold of the horse. But no ruby! Then Harrison, that is my son's name, sent for a broom and went over the place again, sweeping aside the surface snow and examining carefully the ground beneath, but with no better results than before. No ruby could be found. My son came to me panting. Mrs. Burton and myself stood awaiting him in a state of suspense. Guests and fete were alike forgotten. We had heard that the jewel had been found on the campus by one of the students and had been brought back as far as the step in front and then lost again in some unaccountable manner in the snow, and we hoped, nay, expected from moment to moment that it would be brought in. When Harrison entered then, pale, dishevelled and shaking his head, Mrs. Burton caught me by the hand, and I thought she would faint. For this jewel is of far greater value to her than its mere worth in money, though that is by no means small. It is a family jewel and was given to her by her husband under special circumstances. He prizes it even more than she does, and he is not here to counsel or assist her in this extremity. Besides, she was wearing it in direct opposition to his expressed wishes. This I must tell you to show how imperative it is for us to recover it, also to account for the large reward she is willing to pay. When he last looked at it, he noticed that the fastening was a trifle slack, and though he handed the trinket back, he told her distinctly that she was not to wear it till he had been either to Tiffany's or Starr's. But she considered it safe enough, and put it on to please the boys, and lost it. Senator Burton is a hard man, and— In short, the jewel must be found. I give you 1 hour in which to do it." "But, madam," I protested. "I know," she put in, with a quick nod and a glance over her shoulder to see if the door was shut. I have not finished my story. Hearing what Harrison had to say, I took action at once. I bade him call in the guests, whom curiosity or interest still detained on the porch, and seat them in a certain room which I designated to him. Then, after telling him to send 2 men to the gates with orders to hold back all further carriages from entering, and 2 others to shovel up and cart away to the stable every particle of snow for 10 feet each side of the front step, I asked to see Mr. Deane. But here my son whispered something into my ear, which it is my duty to repeat. It was to the effect that Mr. Deane believed that the jewel had been taken from him, that he insisted, in fact, that he had felt a hand touch his breast while he stood awaiting an opportunity to seize the horse. "Very good," said I. "We'll remember that too, but first see that my orders are carried out, and that all approaches to the grounds are guarded and no one allowed to come in or go out without permission from me." He left us, and I was turning to encourage Mrs. Burton when my attention was caught by the eager face of a little friend of mine, who, quite unknown to me, was sitting in one of the corners of the room. She was studying my countenance in a sort of subdued anxiety, hardly natural in one so young, and I was about to call her to my side and question her when she made a sudden dive and vanished from the room. Some impulse made me follow her. She is a conscientious little thing, but timid as a hare, and though I saw she had something to say, it was with difficulty I could make her speak. Only after the most solemn assurances that her name should not be mentioned in the matter, she would give me the following bit of information, which you may possibly think throws another light upon the affair. It seems that she was looking out of one of the front windows when Mr. Deane's carriage drove up. She had been watching the antics of the horse attached to the buggy, but as soon as she saw Mr. Deane going to the assistance of those in danger, she let her eyes stray back to the ladies whom he had left behind him in the carriage. She did not know these ladies, but their looks and gestures interested her, and she watched them quite intently as they leaped to the ground and made their way toward the porch. One went on quickly and without pause to the step, but the other, the one who came last, did not do this. She stopped a moment, perhaps to watch the horse in front, perhaps to draw her cloak more closely about her, and when she again moved on, it was with a start and a hurried glance at her feet, terminating in a quick turn and a sudden stooping to the ground. When she again stood upright, she had something in her hand which she thrust furtively into her breast. "How was this lady dressed?" I inquired. "In a white cloak with an edging of fur. I took pains to learn that too, and it was with some curiosity, I assure you, that I examined the few guests who had now been admitted to the room I had so carefully pointed out to my son. Two of them wore white cloaks, but one of these was Mrs. Dalrymple, and I did not give her or her cloak a second thought. The other was a tall, fine-looking girl, with an air and bearing calculated to rouse admiration if she had not shown so very plainly that she was in a state of inner perturbation. Though she tried to look amiable and pleased, I saw that she had some care on her mind, which, had she been Mr. Deane's fiancée, would have needed no explanation, but as she was only Mr. Deane's fiancée's friend, its cause was not so apparent. The floor of the room, as I had happily remembered, was covered with crash, and as I lifted each garment off I allowed no maid to assist me in this I shook it well, ostensibly because of the few flakes clinging to it, really to see if anything could be shaken out of it. Of course, I met with no success. I had not expected to, but it is my disposition to be thorough. These wraps I saw all hung in an adjoining closet, the door of which I locked. Here's the key. After which I handed my guests over to my son, who led them into the drawing-room, where they joined the few others who had previously arrived, and went myself to telephone to you. I bowed and asked where the young people were now. "Still in the drawing-room. I have ordered the musicians to play and consequently there is more or less dancing. But of course nothing can remove the wet blanket which has fallen over us all, nothing but the finding of this jewel. Do you see your way to accomplishing this? We are from this very moment at your disposal, only I pray that you will make no more disturbance than is necessary, and if possible arouse no suspicions you cannot back up by facts. I dread a scandal almost as much as I do sickness and death, and these young people, well, their lives are all before them, and neither Mrs. Burton nor myself would wish to throw the shadow of a false suspicion over the least of them." I assured her that I sympathized with her scruples, and would do my best to recover the ruby without inflicting undue annoyance upon the innocent. Then I inquired whether it was known that a detective had been called in. She seemed to think it was suspected by some, if not by all, at which my way seemed a trifle complicated. We were about to proceed when another thought struck me. "Madam, you have not said whether the carriage itself was searched." "I forgot. Yes, the carriage was thoroughly overhauled, and before the coachman left the box." "Who did this overhauling?" "My son. He would not trust any other hand than his own in a business of this kind." "One more question, madam. Was any one seen to approach Mr. Deane on the carriage drive prior to his assertion that the jewel was lost?" "No. And there were no tracks in the snow of any such person. My son looked." And I would look, or so I decided within myself, but I said nothing, and in silence we proceeded toward the drawing room. I had left my overcoat behind me, and always being well dressed I did not present so bad an appearance. Still I was not in party attire, and naturally could not pass for a guest if I had wanted to, which I did not. I felt that I must rely on insight in this case, and on a certain power I had always possessed of reading faces. That the case called for just this species of intuition I was positive. Mrs. Burton's ruby was within 100 yards of us at this very moment, probably within 100 feet, but to lay hands on it and without scandal, well, that was a problem calculated to rouse the interest of even an old police officer like myself. A strain of music, desultory, however, and spiritless, like everything else about the place that night, greeted us as Mrs. Ashley opened the door leading directly into the large front hall. Immediately, a scene meant to be festive, but which was, in fact, desolate, burst upon us. The lights, the flowers, and the brilliant appearance of such ladies as flitted into sight from the almost empty parlors were all suggestive of the cheer suitable to a great occasion, but in spite of this, the effect was altogether melancholy, for the hundreds who should have graced this scene, and for whom this illumination had been made and these festoons hung, had been turned away from the gates, and the few who felt they must remain, because their hostess showed no disposition to let them go, wore any but holiday faces, for all their forced smiles and pitiful attempts at nonchalance and gaiety. I scrutinized these faces carefully. I detected nothing in them but annoyance at a situation which certainly was anything but pleasant. Turning to Mrs. Ashley, I requested her to be kind enough to point out her son, adding that I should be glad to have a moment's conversation with him, also with Mr. Deane. "Mr. Deane is in one of these small rooms over there. He is quite upset. Not even Mrs. Burton can comfort him. My son— Oh, here is Harrison." A tall, fine-looking young man was crossing the hall. Mrs. Ashley called him to her, and in another moment we were standing together in one of the empty parlors. I gave him my name and told him my business. Then I said, "Your mother has allotted me an hour in which to find the valuable jewel which has just been lost on these premises." Here I smiled. "She evidently has great confidence in my ability. I must see that I do not disappoint her." All this time I was examining his face. It was a handsome one, as I have said, but it was also a very candid expression. The eyes looked straight into mine, and while showing anxiety, betrayed no deeper emotion than the occasion naturally called for. "Have you any suggestions to offer? I understand that you were on the ground almost as soon as Mr. Deane discovered his loss." His eyes changed a trifle but did not swerve. Of course he had been informed by his mother of the suspicious action of the young lady who had been a member of that gentleman's party, and shrank, as anyone in his position would, from the responsibilities entailed by this knowledge. "No," said he, "we have done all we can. The next move must come from you." "There is one that will settle the matter in a moment," I assured him, still with my eyes fixed scrutinizingly on his face. A universal search, not of places, but of persons, but it is a harsh measure. A most disagreeable one, he emphasized, flushing. Such an indignity offered to guests would never be forgotten or forgiven. True, but if they offered to submit to this themselves? They? How? If you, the son of the house, their host if we may say, should call them together and for your own satisfaction empty out your pockets in the sight of everyone, don't you think that all men, and possibly all the women too, here I let my voice fall suggestively, would be glad to follow suit? It could be done in apparent joke. He shook his head with a straightforward air which raised him in my estimation. "That would call for little but effrontery on my part," said he. "But think what it would demand from these boys who came here for the sole purpose of enjoying themselves. I will not so much as mention the ladies." "Yet one of the latter—" "I know," he quietly acknowledged, growing restless for the first time. I withdrew my eyes from his face. I had learned what I wished. Personally, he did not shrink from search, therefore the jewel was not in his pockets. This left but two persons for suspicion to halt between. But I disclosed nothing of my thoughts. I merely asked pardon for a suggestion that, while pardonable in a man accustomed to handle crime with ungloved hands, could not fail to prove offensive to a gentleman like himself. "We must move by all means less open," I concluded. "It adds to our difficulties, but that cannot be helped. I should now like a glimpse of Mr. Deane." "Do you not wish to speak to him?" "I should prefer a sight of his face first." End of Part 1.